Why is it that when you land at an airport in a foreign country, the runways shine a bit brighter, the sound of the aircraft hums a little quieter, and the customs and immigration staff works just a bit more smoothly? If you're an American, it probably means you're visiting an airport in Europe or increasingly Asia. If you're visiting America, it probably means you're coming from Latin America, poorer parts of Asia, or increasingly the Middle East and Africa. Why these differences exist, and why the tendency of the quality of life seems to reflect the demographic trends more than any other factor should be obvious to anyone who has traveled. In the United States, where the American Society of Civil Engineers gave the state of U.S. infrastructure a grade of D-, the increasing costs and lower quality returns of pouring ever more money into a decaying road, telecom, and public utility system are indicative of deeper societal problems that go beyond explanations of red tape or sheer size and complexity. When the whole of America seems to be lesser than the sum of its parts, perhaps the conclusion should be that the parts should no longer be added together.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
Military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
It's been 9 billion.
На полный разгон гнусных захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Hello, welcome to the show. I'm Nick, and I am not joined by my usual co-hosts this week, who are all absent, with the notable exception of Adam.
Hey.
And to make up for that, we have a very special guest, Dark Enlightenment. And they are going to be talking today about something I know next to nothing about. And before we get started, I would like to thank some recent donors to the program on Patreon and through Bitcoin. We had a very generous Bitcoin donation from Jack, who is at Southern Suit on Twitter. And recent Patreon donations come from I think I may have mentioned a few last week, or a couple weeks ago, rather, but I'll just to be safe, we had Johnny and Redworth. And recently we had Stefan Hashinsky, a Hush, a Darya, and an Andrew White. Thank you very much to everyone who took time to donate. We appreciate that very much. Now, welcome to the show, Dark.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you again for having me.
Happy to have you. What exactly are we going to be discussing today? Because it's a subject I'm very ignorant on, and I would suspect that a good chunk of our audience, or at least a portion of our audience who's like me, also know nothing about it. So why don't you kick us off?
Okay. Well, the Industrial Revolution and its consequences have been a disaster for the human race. They've greatly increased the life expectancy of those of us who live in, quote, advanced countries, but they have destabilized society. They may have made life unfulfilling. They have subjected human beings to indignities. They have led to widespread psychological suffering and third world physical suffering as well, and have inflicted severe damage on the natural world. The continued development of technology will worsen this situation. It will certainly increase human beings in greater indignities and inflict greater damage on the natural world. It will probably lead to greater social disruption and psychological suffering. It may lead to increased physical suffering, even in advanced countries. And of course, that is...
Wait. That was amazing. Was that Bill Clinton?
No. That was Ted Kaczynski in his manifesto. And I know that I'm kind of an expert on infrastructure in these circles. And Adam is interested in this subject as well. And we've got a couple different books and references that we'd like to share. And while Ted Kaczynski was nuts on lots of stuff, the underlying problem we haven't dealt with still the Industrial Revolution is still there, and more importantly, all of the infrastructure we have built since the Industrial Revolution is both very difficult to operate, and it's not entirely certain that we'll be able to maintain it into the future with the more and more third world America, and the consequences of not being able to operate it are very dire indeed. And so there's just a lot of kind of under the surface type issues surrounding infrastructure that need to be talked about, and some possible solutions for you personally. None of these solutions, like if you're listening to this program, you are an official bad man, and you need to secede from the system, because the system is going to come after you with everything it has. I mean, for goodness sakes, they've already desecrated Andrew Johnson's grave, and he was just a guy working on one of these infrastructure issues to make life better for people.
Now let's explain who that is. Is that the fellow who recently committed suicide?
Yes, it is, and he was an electrical engineer working on possibly the one solution to sustainable electricity in this country without having to burn coal or oil to generate power, but rather thorium reactors. That was his passion.
Wow. Well, if I could jump in, I think this is a good example, because someone like that is basically looking around his society and realizing that he's not being incentivized, let alone thanked for any efforts of his work. And frankly, I think a lot of people's lives, besides the basics, revolves around whether or not they can feel like they have a stake or a station in their own community. And when we have a very large society that we would broadly call America, and people move around all the time, and we're using the infrastructure that is sort of set up by these very highly trained and educated people, and they're usually fairly intelligent, the ones that design it at least, and then the people who maintain it usually have very specialized knowledge, so it's not something to take for granted. But when you have people that are sort of like him, who feel like their society hates them, they're not going to really be very motivated at a certain point to be contributing to it anymore. And if they're the ones who are running this stuff, you're quickly going to devolve into a situation like you have in South Africa, where they have these diversity quotas for their power plants, and they have rolling blackouts now. Whereas during apartheid, which is, I'm not going to endorse, some sort of like hierarchical system. On a personal level, I don't like that. I prefer separation. But when you have, yeah, I know you would. I would basically say you guys are on your own, and we need our own territory. But basically, when they did do apartheid, they didn't allow people that they allow in there now to run these pieces of machinery that are very complicated and extremely dangerous, I might add, if it's nuclear. And you can't take this stuff for granted. And so I think a lot of people do, because it's just been there for so long, at least for 100 years in industrialized societies. And so when things start to crack and fray, people get confused as to why there's problems. I can take any metropolitan electric transport system, light rail system in a diverse city in the United States or in Europe. And when I say diverse, I mean non-whites are living with whites. And you're going to find there's huge problems with that infrastructure, whether it's New York, Washington, D.C., Los Angeles is so small, it's not really on the radar. In San Francisco, Seattle, you're going to find that there's big problems when you run across diversity. Whether it's jumping over the turnstiles, or there's just garbage all over the trains. The stations are covered in graffiti. The trains are late. The electronics don't work properly. It's in a clear contrast to a country that is functional in terms of like having a nation. If If you go to Germany, if you go to France, even, which with all its diversity, they still have a functioning train system, from what I know, at least
Or
outside
Japan.
the cities. Or Japan, which has the best in the world. And that's probably one of the most, if not the most, homogenous societies in the world. You see the stark contrast between diversity, our greatest strength, and non-diversity, our non-strength, in America at least. But you can quickly see that the narrative is a lot of horseshit. And so there's cases, there was a report in Oakland where there was like a bunch of blacks who jumped onto a BART train and robbed everyone and then ran off. And the operators of the system would not release the footage because they didn't want to incite racial hatred. But as soon as you say that, you immediately know who was doing those things. And they call it the Dindu delivery system in certain circles. And I've seen it firsthand, where these guys are jumping the turnstiles, not paying for their tickets, and the station operators do nothing because they're straitjacketed by this diversity cult. And so what we're going to have, if we keep going down this trend, and it's gotten worse in my own lifetime, is basically we're going to run into a situation where we've got decrepit infrastructure that nobody wants to invest in because it's going to be destroyed as soon as you do, and the roads are going to get worse, the bridges are going to take longer to build. We had to outsource this big bridge project in the Bay Area to China, which is such an embarrassment because the Golden Gate Bridge and the Bay Bridge were built during the Depression in probably a third of the time, and it was built with American steel. We can't even make the metallurgical products anymore that are sufficient, or at least at the same cost, but the sort of free trade cult is also part of this problem. And we got a bridge that has rusty bolts that break, and then you got to go to China to fix it. I mean, what a stupid idea, right? You have a piece of public infrastructure that is built by a foreign, probably rivalrous country. But our system is so stupid that it actually chooses that over an American-built piece of infrastructure. So
let me jump in here real quick, Adam, with something. I wasn't aware of that young man's background, or else I might have said something at the beginning. But for what it's worth, I'd like to dedicate this show to the late Andrew Dotson.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a very, very sad story, and I get that's not really what we're here to talk about, but it does change my perspective on it a little bit. Just knowing that he was doing something so productive, and he was henpecked to death by his lessers.
Exactly, and I could speak to this in my own life. I mean, I'm by no means the smartest person in the room, when I'm in good, rooms, but I have also experienced the opposite, where I've had people who will throw at me this privilege nonsense, and if I'm in a classroom, for example, I'm the most engaged with the material. I'm offering answers, asking good questions, and then turns around, to this lesbian woman who's basically frowned her way through all of her life and slept through half the class, and she's going to complain as soon as she finds something that she can attack with this privilege bullshit, where she doesn't know the material, she doesn't study, but she gets power in our society over the guy who's really enthusiastic, who's done his work, and he's made fun of. And so I've lived this, and it's like, this is not how society is going to go forward. And you call that progress? This is how the society devolves. It's how it gets destroyed.
Well, we don't live in a society, but I take your point.
That's true. So, in China, if you misbehave on the train, they'll just beat you. Right? They'll just beat you. And China, our friends at Fascination did a great show yesterday about the yellow peril and how China, like, their entire society is weaponized against America. They've probably already surpassed us in terms of economic output. And they have 1.4 billion people.
They no question outpaced us. I mean, in terms of like even the PPP numbers, or the nominal numbers might show that they've outpace this, but the PPP numbers do, which is purchasing power parity. So you basically adjust for prices differences. But I would also add a third one that basically says that what they produce is actually real value versus what America, quote unquote, produces, which is a lot of horse shit on the internet. And, I hope we're not in that category, but basically we don't make products. This is what Donald Trump was talking about when he campaigned. He basically says, we don't make anything. Okay, so if you're in a real situation, what are you going to do? You're going to turn on your iPhone, or you're going to grab something that actually helps you? You need physical hardware when the grid goes down. And it's so absurd that people don't understand that. And I don't blame the average person, but I blame our leaders for being reckless, because they're absolutely irresponsible. They don't know what they're doing, and they've lived in a really sheltered, stupid Ivy League system, or they willingly do it because they're greedy.
They're not our leaders; they're our oppressors.
They're our enemies. I mean, it's as simple as that. But they think that they're somehow leading some form of a nation, but in their minds, they have this sort of like really absurd idea of what the nation is. I think they literally think that the people that they've met in their circles are representative of the rest of the country. And it's absolutely not true. And the people that live in the Beltway or Manhattan or any major urban area on the coast is absolutely out of touch with the majority of people in the United States.
Well, America is run from about 6 cities: Boston for higher education, Los Angeles for propaganda, San Francisco for tech stuff, Washington, D.C., New York. That's basically it. And people from those places. I mean, the state of Virginia all by itself is as big as, or bigger than Austria. So we have this continent-sized empire, right? That is supposed to provide the most modern living to all of these people. And that was the deal, right? I mean, the empire bought off most of the hinterlands by saying, well, none of your political decisions locally are going to matter, and we're going to shove fag marriage and abortion down your throat, but you'll have iPhones and soy food. So,
not only that they're going to have soy sales, because who makes the soy? It's the Heartland. And so actually, I would actually like to sort of ask for a little bit more responsibility from the farmers of the United States, because they're part of the corrupt system when they accept those farm subsidies. The Iowa corn for ethanol, which damages engines, the soybean guys, who basically are one of the few positive trade surplus items the United States has with China. How pathetic is that? People don't even process this. We give them beans that grow from little plants out of the ground, and they give us complicated electronic components back in return, when people in this country fucking invented that stuff. But we've moved all the manufacturing over there, and what do? They copy it. They immediately copy everything. And I can go down the list, but it's just it's so embarrassing. And these idiots who go on the business channels who got to push the free trade shit, or the people who are on the left who basically say, well, we can't upset China, we can't upset them, we don't, and we also don't want to. I mean, what about the hog farmers? What about the pig farmers and growers and raisers? What does that represent? $25 billion a year? I mean, versus what? The $600 billion we lose to China on other goods? And that represents employment for people, too. It also
Americans
represents
can eat
skills,
bacon.
Which we have none left.
China, of course, is buying up Africa. And I would encourage everyone to, this is not the point of this show, but lying is the central Sun Tzu said all warfare is deception, and that kind of, the Chinese view everything is war. They've had thousands of wars over their history, a war every 1.2 years or something. The Chinese will just lie. They have no regard for the truth. Not to do little post too much, but
they're not as good at it as the Jews, but they do it too.
Well,
they're yellow Jews basically, and And what we have done is traded our ability to do real things, which we'll get to into in just a minute, to the Chinese for like a marginal return of a couple percent, to carry on lying to ourselves, right? And the Chinese are genuinely terrible people. I was at the Portland Zoo relatively recently with the fam, and they have moored tigers there at the Siberian tigers. There's like 500 of these things left in the wild, and it's one of the most magnificent creatures God created. And the reason there's only 500 left is they're worth about $60,000 or $50,000 poaching, because Chinese men will turn them into boner pills. Now, the Chinese will turn anything into either boner pills or some sort of weird food dish. And we're supposed to put up with people that will just kill the last something because they're folk medicine that everyone knows is false. Says, oh, if I grind up this tiger dick, it'll give us boner pills. And we're going to trade all of our industrial capacity to people who think that this is acceptable behavior, and somehow it's going to work.
Even if they didn't, I mean, why would you give away your trade secrets? I mean, it's so stupid. It's short-sighted. You said it. It's a marginal profit gain because you're cutting your costs. And this is the Wall Street mentality, right? This is why I hate these fuckers. But basically, they get compensated for very short-term gains, but they're not going to be around in 20 years when the company goes bankrupt because all the trade secrets were stolen and the costs were basically moved to a competitor company right down the road, which has the same employees that you hired in China, who basically copied everything and then walked down the street because their uncle paid them a little bit more to give the secrets to them. That destroys an economy. That destroys an industrial power that won the Second World War, basically, and it's almost all gone. I mean, it's just, people will say, "Oh, we make more than we ever did before," but you know what? We don't, because we make probably more now in China that gets sent back to us, and our population has gone up. So that argument is silly.
Okay, so talk about destroying things. Okay. At one time, Los Angeles had one of the best public transportation systems in the country. The Washington, D.C. Metro was the wonder of the world in terms of public transit, and now it's terrible. And overall, America's infrastructure score is a D+, according to the American Society of Civil Engineers, and you can go to infrastructurereportcard.org to see this for yourself. And there's actually a pretty good report talking about this issue. Now, admittedly, it's a little bit self-serving for a bunch of civil engineers to say, hey, you need to spend a bunch of money on infrastructure and stuff. But I don't need to tell you that roads around your town suck. You drive over them and they're full of potholes. I don't need, like if you've been stuck in a traffic jam for 6 hours, if you're commuting 90 minutes, I don't need to tell you this is terrible. If you're getting frequent electrical out, not working, then it's obvious to you it sucks, right? Your local airport, right? Looks like the cutting edge of 1970s technology, and it hasn't been updated since then, and it doesn't function well, and your bridges that are inadequate, and like we have a passenger rail system, to quote James Howard Kunstler, that would embarrass Bulgaria. There's all kinds of issues that are obvious to everyone that stuff doesn't work anymore. I was talking
what is absurd, though, is that people, it seems like, especially the younger people, although I would consider us sort of in that category of being relatively young, I don't know if it's the iPhone or what, but they just don't seem to have a historical reference point for how shitty our country has turned into. I mean, just in terms of just basics, like architecture sucks, like the The roads obviously are terrible. The public infrastructure is just not maintained very well. And I'm
have
not
a question.
saying go ahead. Yeah.
So, Dark, what's the main reason that America? I mean, even if America, you mentioned Los Angeles has at one point had superior transportation infrastructure, but what is the main reason that Europe got, for instance, rail systems right compared to America? Is it just America's relationship with open space and the automobile, and how so-called manifest destiny played itself out?
Well, it's kind of I think it was episode 27 that we did last year. It ultimately kind of comes down to race and our inability to deal with the racial questions. Honestly, I think, because
I think that's true for the East Coast of the United States, where they probably have similar population density, but in the West, I mean, forget it. You're not going to make money on a high-speed rail system. That's frankly a waste of capital. But in terms of the East Coast, where Amtrak, I think the train flipped off the track a couple of years ago or something. Yeah, you could make that argument.
But the reason Europe was able to, Spain has a perfectly adequate rail network, right? And when you look at the Midwest, Chicago, Indianapolis, parts of Iowa, right? That's about the size of Spain. So you could actually have a decent rail network that linked, with Chicago as the hub, which Chicago used to be the world's biggest rail hub. That could actually work. So I'm trying to condense hundreds of hours of reading into as brief a presentation as possible. Because Europe was relatively poor after the war, they didn't have the money to, just spend a lot of money on highways, whereas we did in the 50s with the National Defense Highway Act, whatever, the Eisenhower interstate system that cost a lot of money. At the same time that Europe was trying to reindustrialize and get back on its feet, they were able to, get railroads to work, which are relatively lower cost, take less right of way, have lower transport costs, that kind of thing. So that's probably part of it. The fact that they had that high trust society that was almost completely homogenous, and so behavior on trains was acceptable until relatively recently in all of European countries and Japan and all those places. That's probably part of it. And also probably part of it is just the sheer scale of this continent-wide empire. I mean, the distance from where I used to live in Anchorage, Alaska, or near Anchorage, Alaska, to Miami is the same distance from Lisbon to Kazakhstan. It's,
Would you say too big, too fast?
Too big, not only too big, too fast, but just trying to impose one system on that varied a region is really ridiculous when you think about it. So,
yeah, and to put on my bow tie, I would say that having a centrally planned infrastructure system would probably be a disaster, even if you did have a homogeneous society. I think it's helpful to have, I always say this, but I think it's helpful to have more local control. You do want to coordinate, obviously, if you have a rail system, but you learn a lot more when you are able to be flexible, and you get a lot done in the long run, I think, faster, as opposed to investing in one giant system where we're still living with this sort of interstate system today. I mean, it's not going to change. It's too big of a sunk cost. People don't see it as something that they can reform very easily. And these highways are not going away unless you have an earthquake like San Francisco did.
But Adam, you mentioned Japan earlier as the finest rail system in the world. Right. I mean, Japan is completely planned, is it not?
Yeah, and they also had a huge firebombing on their country during the war, which was way worse than nuclear bombs, by the way, which people don't seem to understand. But everything was just wiped out, so they could very easily do something from scratch. Whereas now, actually, they have a very hard time doing anything that's kind of big on that scale at least, because everything is built up. So yeah, it's very planned, but they're also much more plan-oriented people. They're reliable, they keep their word, and they're on time. So, get the smorgasbord of people in America to do that, and you're doing well.
It's impossible. And to give you an example, it's not just the railways, which overall the ASC gives us a B. I think that's complete nonsense. But our aviation gets a D. Bridges get a C+. Dams get a D. Our drinking water gets a D. Energy gets a D. Hazardous waste gets a D+. Inland waterways get a D. Levees get a D. Ports get a C+. Public parks get a D+. Rails get a B. Roads get a D. Schools get a D+. Solid waste gets a C+. Transit gets a D-. Wastewater gets a D+. So this is admittedly the self-interested.
Yeah, do you know roughly what they would consider an A versus a D? Like, what's the difference?
Level of functionality, like able to see how make it a grade. Makes a grade. So there's capacity, condition, funding, future needs, operations, maintenance, safety, resilience, and innovation. So that's the is it adequate for the future? Does it work well now, and will it continue to work well into the future with growth continuing?
Sure. Yeah, I've looked at that before. I just couldn't remember off the top of my head, but we'll link to the American Society of Civil Engineers report card and take a look.
So most all of it, right, is mediocre, requires attention, poor, and at risk. That's where most of our infrastructure is at. And I'm one of the ostensible experts on this issue, and even I didn't know, just how much there is out there that we're all utterly dependent upon, that could fail fairly easily.
Well, let's go down the list real quick for a second. Water, probably 1. 2, probably electricity. 3, I guess heating if you're in a cold climate. Air conditioning, probably 4th if you're in a hot climate. Municipal sanitation, and then maybe transportation. That'd be my list.
Oh, sure. Those are all. I mean, if you don't have
in that order too, that I would say those are the most critical.
Right. Like if you don't have clean water, you're dead in 3 days. You don't have water, but you die really fast. And there's a book. Was it Unique who mentioned it earlier? Energy, the Master Resource.
Yes. I mentioned that. It's the one book I've read on the subject.
But it really is the master resource, right? I mean, you think about it. Oil started being a thing in the 1870s in Pennsylvania, if I remember right. And that really kind of kicked off, the whole Industrial Revolution. And it's really only 150 years old. Are pulling fossil fuel out of the ground, and we've already pulled most of it out of the ground, or we're very soon going to do that.
Well, now that you're on the topic of oil, one of the big differences is there's still oil, but you have to do a lot more work to get it out. And I think I heard a statistic from Kunstler, who basically said that the amount of energy you actually have to input, forget the price for a second, but just in terms of energy efficiency, to kind of prove that this trend is not going in a positive trend. Let's say in the 1950s, the number of barrels, I'm doing this from memory, so this is rough, but the number of barrels that you would get out for every barrel of energy input to extracting it was like 50 output for every one you put in. And then for the 1990s, it was 30 to 1, and now we're down to like 17. So you can see the trend is like less and less return for energy invested. And so what in practice that means is basically you have to drill sideways. You have to go down and then you have to go out versus just going straight down. And so imagine the engineering requirements for doing a drilling that is like got an elbow in it, and you are going in all those different directions, and then all the sort of fracture problems with like all of that fanning out underneath the strata of the earth. You're dealing with subsidence issues, aquifer issues. This is what the fracking controversies are basically centered around. So the footprint is actually quite large now, even though you can't see it. It's underneath, but the amount of work you have to do to get that stuff out is more and more.
Yeah, absolutely. And every one of these issues, I mean, every single one of these issues requires like master's degrees levels of expertise to just begin to understand.
Yeah, the engineering is incredible. I mean, just the degrees, like you're saying. Yeah.
There's an immense amount of work that goes into fully understanding this stuff, and we have a population less and less capable of even beginning to understand.
And this is why we're importing
this is a problem
from Asia, which is, again, it's like you're eating your seed corn here. These people aren't loyal to the United States, at least the one that we're part of in our minds.
Right. I mean, like cheating when it comes to cheating on tests, that they're the number one culprit.
I've seen it. It's terrible. I mean, let's talk homework help or exam help. I mean, Jesus, like they don't even view it like it's a problem. I mean, and I'll even give a more extreme example. I've known some Russians, and they tell me that if the professor sees that you're not cheating, he thinks there's something wrong with you because you're stupid. So they expect you to cheat in those societies.
Right. Of course. And of course, how many ethnic Chinese have been caught, working for the Department of Defense or in the Army or in various branches of the military, intelligence establishment, and of course they're caught spying, right? So, this infrastructure stuff. I mean, with NSA no bully, but there's software out there that can perform geographic analyses. That's trivially easy to do, and thank God that most terrorists are Arabs and therefore inbred and retarded. Because if they were really smart, like if we ever had like a real like Chinese terrorist problem, we'd be so screwed it wouldn't even be funny.
Yeah, I know what you mean, but I'm not convinced most terrorists are Arab. I think if you broaden your definition of terrorist, there's a lot more people in that list.
Are you thinking more also fellow Semites or?
Sure,
just other.
They would be included, but I would say anybody who's subverting you, and I don't care if it's obvious. It really the what matters is the effect, right?
Of course. Well, but there's all kinds of vulnerabilities in this system, right? And the return on investment that we're getting is less and less and less. So, from another book, Brian Hayes' book, just titled Infrastructure. From the opening chapter, he talks about mining. It's kind of like the resource extraction overall being like
it's like sort of starting chronologically, almost like hunter-gatherer terms. All right, rock, pull out of ground, sharpen, like you can sort of see how the evolution of things operated.
Right, but one of the things he talks about is like the deepest mine in the world is like 13,000 feet down in South Africa. It's a gold.
Right, I couldn't believe that too. I was reading that, and I'm like, holy shit. And the greater point I thought was that the temperature increases every 300 feet you go down. And so the temperatures at that level is like 30, 40 degrees more or something like that.
It's really, really warm.
Yeah.
But one of the things that like you have to have like a steel cable, the best steel cable you could possibly imagine, would snap under its own weight if it was 13,000 feet long. So they have to do multiple stagings of these cables to bring people up and out. And so the cost per ounce, right, of making that mine work is like $1,000 an ounce. Less than $1,000 an ounce. It's just not worth it because it's so expensive to get that gold out of the ground. So it's there. There's billions of barrels of oil that we know are there that we just can't get to because it's so expensive to get. I mean, at the point where, there are some places where you're like getting 1.1 barrels of oil per barrel that you get out of the ground. In the more difficult places in the world, that's the kind of return you're getting. And so prudent societies, sane societies, wouldn't waste things like that the way we do. And they would make it known just how difficult it is to get all this stuff out, and how hard people have to work, and how dangerous it is to do things like deliver electricity on a consistent basis. How dangerous it can be, shipping these multi-tons of goods across the country, disposing of waste, things like that. There's all kinds of issues that saner societies would actually attempt to preserve as the commons of, like, wow, we're really lucky to have electricity. We shouldn't do things that make electricity more difficult to generate, harder to deliver, and all that other stuff. And of course, but because we don't live in a sane society, or we don't, as Nick pointed out, we don't even really live in a society. We can just kind of is all over this stuff. And to talk about this Hayes book for just a second, he goes into mining, waterworks, food and farming, oil and gas, power plants, power grid, communications, roads, railroads, bridges, tunnels, aviation, shipping, waste, and recycling. So it's not entirely like one-to-one correspondence with the ASCE report, but it's a pretty good. If both those subjects are covered in the report and in the book, it's a vital area of interest in terms of infrastructure. And California has brownouts. The richest part of the country has no power.
Well, that happened most memorably during the 2002 period, when I think it was actually a lot to do with some of the deregulation that had happened, and the system was sort of. It's a good example because basically you take a very complex system and you change it and you see what happens, and that it didn't work very well, at least the transition period. But the methodology or the ideology involved was, and obviously a lot of it is business interest too, people trying to make money and political machinations. But the ideological argument was that it's sort of a utility system that's regulated heavily by the government, and if we deregulate and have competition, more choice, lower prices, better service. And that's basically the argument they made with the airlines and the trucking industry in the 70s, which probably worked, but obviously now you're sitting, in a Southwest seat next to a giant fat person, and everything's, the food's terrible, and so there's trade-offs. But the sort of events that happened in that period in California were that basically they were trading power out of their traditional trading partners, and the prices were fluctuating. And the very famous company Enron was actually involved in some of this, and there's audio tape of these traders talking about how they're basically they're hoping these like grandmas like can't turn on their breathing machines because the price is going to be so high. They're going to make so much money, they won't be willing to turn on their breathing machines. I mean, it's pretty disgusting. So
yeah, sickening. Have you read Nicholas Nassim Taleb's Anti-Fragile?
Great book.
Yeah, because it seems, again, I'm very ignorant on the subject of mechanical stuff and infrastructure, but it seems to me that you talk about all these vulnerabilities in the infrastructure system, and I should also add that I'm also not particularly invested in seeing America continue to work.
Well, I want to talk about that with you later because I actually want to make sure that you understand what you take for granted now. Because if you rip out all that infrastructure, your worldview is undoubtedly going to change, as will mine. I mean, I'm sure I take a lot for granted too, but
I don't doubt that I take for. I mean,
I'll give you a quick example. Somebody shut off my water accidentally once. And you see how things change when you don't have water. Just, toilets, sinks, drinking, showers, all of it's gone. That's a quick example. Go ahead.
So, well, look, I don't doubt that it would be it would cause widespread chaos and death. I'm just saying that
probably the biggest one is disease.
I can't look at America from the perspective of a tinkerer who wants to reform it. But that being said,
oh yeah, I'm with you.
No, I'm not invested in the system at all. I was talking with my friend Neo Victorian one time several years ago. He asked me a question. He said, "Why are you a reactionary?" And I thought about it for a minute. I said, "I'm a reactionary because stuff used to work, and now it doesn't." And you ask, and you kind of trace that back as to why stuff used to work and now it doesn't. And there's complex political issues behind it that have real world effects, right? I like running water. Civil engineers have saved more lives than doctors. If you want to know what life is like without modern conveniences, look at what like cholera and typhus do to a population. It's terrible, and that's where we're headed. It is that.
Yeah, and you might lose a lot of the people that you care about too. So it's not like all the ignorant people are going to go by the wayside, or the bad people's. Bad people are probably smart enough to have backup plans, but you might lose a lot of people on your team. And so when you have disease, when you have widespread chaos, it's hard to get control on that. And so what I wanted to discuss later was basically how do you prepare for that? And again, people like to make fun of preppers, but I don't think it's unwise to have some extra water.
Before we do the prepper routine, like I agree. Like, let me clarify what I mean by that. I'm not against technology. I look at it from the political perspective that I don't want to give more legitimacy to the system than it deserves, and
we don't either. Yeah. We just want people to be prepared in a good way so that you survive, number one, and number two, you can actually steer the outcome in a beneficial way. And the problem though is that if you just pull the plug, go ahead,
Nick, one of the chief reasons I don't believe the system is legitimate anymore, hasn't been for a very long time, is that it has been unable to provide functioning infrastructure. Right?
Exactly. And so if this is going to be fixed, we want it to be fixed on our terms.
Right. No, I don't think that the present system can fix itself. I am saying that one of the, ability to provide physical safety is the number one source of legitimacy for any particular government, and close behind that is does stuff like water and sewer and roads work?
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And
absolutely.
And the fact of the matter is that America, the empire as it were, it is not able to provide number one because it refuses to do basic stuff like execute criminals and enforce the law, and barely able to do number two in terms of roads and bridges and adequate sewer and things like that, because it keeps importing people who don't understand how this works, don't appreciate it, don't take care of it, and expects you to make bricks without straw. Like something like 90% or more of the people driving the trains in Washington D.C. are black. Like this
Right.
is why. You know why Washington D.C. Metro sucks? I mean,
I mean, are they
No,
actually
it doesn't seem like
driving
they-
it though? Because let me give you an anecdote. In the Bay Area, the BART system is automated, and all the drivers—they're not even drivers; they're called like operators. You know what they operate? They operate the doors. Okay, these fuckers that make six figures don't do shit. So
Yeah.
I can go on, but anyway, go ahead.
Well, my brief polemic was a preface to I wanted to discuss the concept of anti-fragile, because in creating a actually functioning infrastructure system, a civilization, I think that Taleb's concept is very valuable, because for people who haven't read it, anti-fragile, as Taleb will be quick to point out, is not to be confused with robustness or resilience. It's things that actually benefit from shocks, from disorder, that the system becomes stronger, because not always in the case of the individual things, oftentimes he gives the analogy, that which kills, rather the adaptation of Nietzsche's aphorism, that which kills you makes me stronger. And the system on a whole can benefit from failure. That would be an anti-fragile system, where, yes, because you can't predict and you cannot prevent failures from happening. What you can do is create a system in which those failures then provide benefits after the fact for the rest of the system.
Sure. It's a great insight he had.
Right.
Unfortunately, he has a financial background, and so he has less of an engineering background. Not to say that he's not intelligent. He's quite a strong mathematical capability, but he's a quant, and so basically, when you work on Wall Street as a quant, you basically run equations to find pricing inefficiencies, and then you price things. And so his sort of frame of mind is coming from that. When in finance, something that's anti-fragile is basically like an option, and if the price changes, you make money. It doesn't really work that well in the real world, because financial instruments are basically just made up.
No, that's not true.
But
His whole book is adapting these principles.
I didn't say it wasn't true in general, but I'm saying his background is from finance, and so his analogies are coming from that, and their applicability to the real world are less apt than in finance. It's much easier to do it
He
in
provides
finance.
endless mechanical and infrastructure analogies. I mean,
Give me the
that's
best
actually a
one,
huge part.
because I remember there was a couple, but I was looking for more.
Well, he talks about Fukushima. He talks about automation and airlines. I mean, he talks
How are
about
those
a lot of
How are
different.
those anti-fragile?
What's
You
what's
said
that?
Fukushima and airlines. What is anti-fragile about one of those?
No, it's an example for understanding why it should be. I mean, Fukushima, it's a disaster.
Yeah, he gives a lot of problems, but he doesn't give a lot of like, oh, here's a anti-fragile system. There was a couple, like the one I kind of invented it myself, but it was basically like the one that I didn't invent it, but it was sort of I applied this theory to something in the real world. I think the good anti-fragile example that I can sort of explain to people is basically like, well, you go to the gym and you strain your muscles, but then they get bigger. There's not a lot of that in the mechanical world. There's some of that in the organic world, because the sort of adaptation is actually somewhat anti-fragile. And you can have it in sort of artificial intelligence systems where you sort of train things where they get smarter. But basically the condition is you need to have a shock, and then you need to have a benefit over time from that. And you need to give me a real world physical example, like an infrastructure that, I don't think he has, because I don't really think they exist that much. That's sort of my point. Like, you take a bridge, you run over.
There's a difference between the individual bridge and a system of infrastructure.
Give me a real example, Nick. You need to understand this. Like, what are you talking about?
You're not understanding his concept, dude.
I understand his concept. What I'm explaining to you is that there's not a lot of real physical examples of where this exists. If you can come up with some, that's fantastic. But
no, it's how you think about it. It's how the system works together. So if a bridge fails,
our system has failed because it didn't build itself to be anti-fragile.
Okay, but
so
give me
to give
a
you an
real
example
though,
of
it's like
an anti-fragile
yeah.
system. An anti-fragile system would be if your power generation came from
See, it's
partially.
hard. I'm not knocking it. I'm just saying it's
like
hard.
An anti-fragile power system would come from thorium coal, solar, and wind, right? So that at any particular time that's
robust. That's not anti-fragile. Because you have basically backups. If it was like, okay, if you had there was like a system outage, but then somehow like that like generated electricity in another way, and you had like sort of a system that grabbed that, or if you had like a bridge that collapsed, somehow you could recoup the energy loss. I mean, it's in physics, like there's no free lunch is sort of my point. In finance, you can make shit up, but you can kind of like capture stuff from an action, but it's Newton's law. It's like you've got an action and then you have an equal and opposite reaction, and there's usually waste involved. So if you take an internal combustion engine, for example, you're only getting about 30% of the energy you put in terms of locomotive force. Most of it is lost in heat. So there's very few real world examples where you get more than what you put in. And if you get it to be very efficient, that's sort of robust. But I would argue that you have to get more out of it, or at least pretty close to what you put into it, to be anti-fragile. That's sort of my argument, but
Well, again, there's a difference between the individual bridge and the fact that bridges continue to be built. Okay, a failed bridge improves bridge design.
Yes, that's the right way to look at it. It's basically if you have like a learning process that things improve, that's good. And I remember he also cited Silicon Valley as sort of being better than like Wall Street capitalism, where basically you kind of like repo shit that fell apart, but you don't really learn anything. Versus Silicon Valley, where you give little seed money to lots of different ideas, then they sort of experiment, and then they fail fast if they suck, but then the ones that are good, then they explode. I think you could say that's an anti-fragile system if you look at it from kind of like a educational process. I think that is true. But again, it's not like a physical process. So that's really my point here. It's like if you talk about infrastructure, you have to kind of look at it from a systems point of view over time. You can't look at it from an individual bridge. Maybe that's your point, Nick, but I need to be clear about that.
I'm talking about how you do infrastructure as a whole.
Okay.
Yeah, well, Taleb has a lot of valuable insights, and I think that
I don't want people to worship him either, though, because remember he was a trader in options. He made a lot of money doing that, and now he sits in Manhattan. He's not an engineer. It's a different discipline, but he's a scholar.
It is, and I will always love him for his hatred of Monsanto. But infrastructure physically wears out. Okay, you can't train tracks don't regrow themselves.
Exactly.
As you use them, unlike your muscles. And so in the United States today, right, like we've talked about a lot of different systems that we have problems with that are basically essential to living the way you do today, and none of them are in robust good health that will continually serve you as time goes on and as you become less and less able as you get older. These systems will break down because that's just the inherent nature of thermodynamics. You don't get a free lunch out of this. So the genesis of me being on the show again was Adam and I were talking about a show I did a while ago about colonies, and what I guess my goal is to get, if you're listening to the show, you're a bad man and a thought criminal, and they will hunt you down and dox you, and just for listening to the show, just for being my friend on Twitter or following Adam or anything else. If you are one of the people that understands that we have some severe problems, and I don't really care which direction you come at it from, whether you're a monarchist, a ortho bro, whatever, they're not going to care about those distinctions that we want to make amongst ourselves, and you're going to be hunted. And so you have to secede from the system as best you can, and understand that there are tons of things that the system does for you, albeit very badly, that you're dependent upon, that you don't know you're dependent upon them. And so our infrastructure doesn't work for multiple reasons. Central planning, I mean, put on your bow tie and talk about the calculation problem, and that's certainly true. The racial angle of people who are not capable of maintaining commons and paying into those commons to maintain them is certainly true. I mean, there's a multivariate problem here. And what we need to do is come up with our own ways to get water. Come up with your own ways to, grow your own food. It's not easy to feed yourself entirely out of a garden, but it's possible to feed yourself and then maybe find a local farmer. Energy needs. You can collect a lot of your own energy needs if you need, if you work at it. Power, you can do that. If you've just got your own little homestead, you don't need a power grid. If you've got, communications, if you have your ham radio and, there's roads. If you don't commute to work, you don't need a road. Who cares if the public school, if the roof is falling in, if your kids don't go there?
Well, if I could jump in, this whole concept of work is kind of a sort of a bastardized version of it today, because you work for somebody else, usually. It's like 90%. There's a funny clip on YouTube where somebody basically videoed Deus Ex, the video game, and there was this scene where this guy is just dropping red pills of in the 1900s, 90% of Americans worked for themselves. Now it's less than 2%, and the top corporations run everything. It's true, though. And you don't have real control of your destiny when you have to depend on these people who basically don't care about you. They're not your family. That can fire you, replace you with somebody else who is cheaper, harder working, and more obedient. And that's what capitalism incentivizes. So, traditionally America, and it's a new country, it's a young country, but when I say traditionally, I mean relatively, close to the beginning of the country's founding, people were farmers and they were homesteaders that literally did this on their own. And so when you worked, you did for your family. It wasn't for some, the man, the woman now, depending on what city you're in, but you did it because you cared about yourself, your life, your family, and you were very motivated. And you didn't really view it as work. I can tell you from personal experience, when I've worked for other people versus for myself, I don't really consider working when I'm doing it for myself as work. It's like an investment, and it feels good. And yeah, you probably have to put in more hours, but you're probably going to have a lot more control over what those hours are doing, and you're going to get a lot more satisfaction out of it. At least I do. And you're probably going to have to work more. So a lot of people get scared by that. But I tell you what, try having a family and trusting a guy who doesn't know you, doesn't care about you, to keep you employed, and then you're chained to a city that you probably hate because it's been flooded with all these people you don't like, and the infrastructure is terrible, and they call it golden handcuffs. You basically you're chained to this money, and you won't leave, even though the schools suck and you can't send your kids to school without an escort because the streets are too dangerous. That's a shitty deal, in my book. And I think it's hard to do this, but if you teach yourself how to do things, and you're hardworking, you can figure out a lot of the things that the infrastructure, used to provide better, but sort of provides now, and do it on your own. And you're going to have a lot more security, which is on Dark's list of number one thing the government should provide. It's not providing. So you're going to have more security, stability, ownership, and then you're also going to meet people who do this too, and then you're going to have a common bond, and a respect built out of people who actually put in their own sweat equity into things. And that's the real community, where people actually have, ownership and stakes in something versus something where you're basically just part of a greater machine that nobody really controls, and the sort of faceless entities that actually run things never really show themselves. And it's really sort of kind of a sad existence for most people. So I would say it's just a better choice if you can do it.
Well, so we deal here with the political question and the reality of history. And I would say, well, people might be interested in how they can improve their own lives and how they can survive. I'm going to continue to shill Taleb's concept. And I'm going to say that from the political perspective, if you're able to secure a way of living outside of the system, and you have a political goal, you can make these colonies anti-fragile, again, in the sense that a catastrophic system failure could gain for you politically. Because if you are able to provide some measure of security and material necessities, that's on your way to building a state.
You gain economically too, because you have actually a functioning system, whereas the alternative is dysfunctional or non-existent. And so suddenly you have bargaining power. So it's not just political,
exactly.
But you have true leverage. It's money and also the physical, political aspects that you might have as well.
So to give an example of the impending failure of the system, there's a gentleman by the name of Chuck Marone at strongtowns.org, name of the website, and he goes into greater detail as to why the system is failing. But to give you, just use some round numbers. Let's say that a subdivision of 100 homes costs $1 million to put in all the infrastructure for those 100 homes, right? So that's $10,000 per home to put in the infrastructure to make that place work, right? My math working out there, right?
Yeah, it sounds right.
Yeah, $10,000. Okay. And let's say that the repayment period is 20 years to replace that infrastructure every 20 years. Well, if that's $500
$500, yeah.
$500 a year. So, but not only do you have to pay for the initial investment, you've got to also pay for the replacement. And so if you could, that's really, over that 20 years, you've got to, they use the first 10 to pay back that 1,000. You need $1,000 a year to pay back the initial investment. And then you need $1,000 a month, $1,000 a year for the next 10 years to pay off that. And then from there on, you could do $500 a month or $500 a year. Well, if you can only get $900 in taxes out of that, you're losing on every transaction and making it up in the volume. And Marone goes into detail as to why this is happening. But the system...
People don't understand that. It's actually a joke when people say, well, we lose each money on each transaction, but we make it up in volume. You basically will lose more if you have more transactions where you lose each time. So anyway, just to clarify, I actually didn't understand that when I was younger, so I thought that was actually some kind of weird argument, kind of like how .coms were like, well, we lose money, but we have eyeballs, and so it's fine. Believe it or not, people don't get that. So go ahead.
Okay, but it's a joke, but it's not. And so each of these suburban communities is a net money loser over time, right? And in order to create an anti-fragile system that actually works for people, right? you need to provide those basics of security and infrastructure that work. And you need to do it in a completely different way. And Adam, you and I had talked offline about a show I'd done with our friend Musonius Rufus from Rebel Yell about colonies. I think that was back in January of this year, maybe December of last year. And how that is really your model going forward.
Yeah, I believe it was December, and I highly, highly recommend it. So that's why I wanted to talk to you, Dark. So let's get into it.
Okay. So, okay. I strongly encourage people who are interested to check out this Hayes book or and all these other things, right, that we've been talking about. But you can't do any one of these things by yourself. Okay, you might be able to provide like solar panels, but you're not going to be able to build a power plant by yourself. You're not going to be able to provide a water plant by yourself. You're not going to be able to keep a road up in and out of your community by yourself. These are all collective action problems that have required some form of commons to come together, and then 10 or 20 or 30 families will get together and actually do something. And realize that the current system, even if it wanted to right the ship, and probably can't for financial reasons, the Morone details, it doesn't want to help you. Even if they could make it work for Shaniqua and Juan and all of the other people of the coalition of the Ascend, and they don't want to help you, heterosexual white man. And you need to come up with a way to provide all this stuff for yourself and for your compatriots, because right now they're just like, oh, we're going to take your domain. I wouldn't be the least bit surprised in the future to say, oh, Richard Spencer doesn't deserve to have running water or power to his house. And I hope Richard is listening, and hope he has plans to provide these things for himself, because they will try and take your ability to not get cholera and to have the lights on. And if you understand how big a problem infrastructure is, how much of society's wealth has gone into basically overhead, and how you're not part of that society anymore, then you need to make some plans to provide that for yourself.
Well, let me give you the audience an example. And Dark, don't answer, because I think you'll probably be able to figure it out. And you probably already know this. But Nick, if you haven't thought about this, I'd love to hear if you can guess it. What is the largest machine in the world?
The largest single machine?
I'm not sure what you mean by that, but yeah, it's like yes.
I don't know, that nuclear the nuclear collider.
Not a bad guess. You want to make one more?
Zog.
Okay. Sure. Yeah, that's probably true. If you call that a machine, it's more of like a Frankenstein Borg entity, but yeah, so it's half alien, half machine. The traditional answer to that is the U.S. electric grid. Maybe the Chinese electric grid is bigger now, but the electrical grids are actually the largest single machines in existence, because they're all interconnected and they work together. Those different components. And if one node goes down, there's backup nodes, but they depend on each other. So you can think of it as a machine. And it's probably bigger than the telecom network too, because it powers the telecom network, okay, and it powers everything else. So it is truly gargantuan, and it's the reason General Electric and Siemens and Mitsubishi and all these giant conglomerate companies exist, is that they sell gargantuan pieces of the puzzle that go into these larger electric grids. And if you look at Earth from space, you can clearly see that all those lights, which don't actually use up that much amperage, but you can clearly see the footprint of the electric system. It's everywhere. So trying to duplicate that on small scale without all of the expertise and capital behind you to do it is no small task. And we take it for granted that the lights are on and the electric blender works and the refrigerator probably should be underscored because that preserves all the food from spoiling, works. But just imagine what happened to Katrina, and you EMP strike whatever target you want, and all that power system goes out, and all the food spoils, all the pandemonium that would be unleashed after that. It's a big deal. So in order to get off the dependency of that, you can do it, but you have to know how to generate electricity, or not even need it in the first place, which is probably the even more sort of robust system. And then if we're in anti-fragile mode, you would probably want to be in the business of making alternative energy systems. Now, I'm not suggesting people go off and make a Cylindra with their buddies, because that for various reasons didn't work. But I would say on a smaller scale, if people can learn how to do simple steam engines, if they're mechanically inclined, or even something like a little paddle wheel on a creek, that you don't even have to have electricity. Basically, you're just getting a belt-driven system that could run a sawmill, or it could churn wheat, or churn butter is probably the more apt word for that, but it would mill wheat. And that's what they used to do. That's what those big windmills in Holland are for, I do believe. They're for grain. So this is actually how things used to work. And in order to do it yourself, you have to just understand basic principles behind it. But it is probably a large undertaking for people who haven't thought about it. But it's not that hard, because obviously this stuff has been done for thousands of years if you know what you're doing. But I thought that would be a good starting example.
An overshot mill wheel and get an enormous amount of energy out of it.
Yeah, and it's basically free as long as you have enough water. So it's pretty easy to set that up. And, you know, if you used to play with Legos, I mean, you can kind of like figure that out. It shouldn't be hard.
Well, even that is, you know, all of this stuff is harder than experts make it look. And
actually, one thing that I should point out, I'm actually asking you, Dark, if you know about this, but what are the best sources of lubrication, assuming that the petroleum infrastructure is out? Because people don't realize, again, these are hidden things we take for granted, but like lubricants are actually vital to any mechanical system. Engines would just immediately explode without oil. You need lubrication for axles, for transportation, anything that's moving and causing friction, and you want it to roll or something like that within like a bearing structure. You absolutely need lubrication. And that's basically just a liquid that's not going to dry up and transfers sort of the heat around so it doesn't burn, is essential. And this is why the petroleum industry actually got its start, because it was a great alternative to whaling oil, which was running out because people had hunted these things to near extinction because it was so important for the industrial revolution infrastructure to not power, but just lubricate literally the gears and the windmills and the sawmills and the paper mills and all the mills and all the things that even were running back in the colonial days on those New England little cottage, workshops where they would have like those overshot wheels. You needed to lubricate those things. So those are
the
things
belts. The whale, because whales are so large, the whale skin made great belting material for that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Well, without oil, we are so screwed. We are so screwed in a million different ways, right?
Well, this is actually, it's not going to run out, okay? It'll just get more expensive. And the question is, like, how high is that number going to go where it becomes, like, ridiculous, and then you really have to seek alternatives? It will not go away because it's practically impossible to pull it all out of the ground. But what I would predict what will happen is that you will start seeing substitution effects happening pretty quickly, and then the critical stuff like lubrication is going to take priority, and plastics probably are going to be still pretty useful. So I think that would probably be up there too. But in terms of the internal combustion engine usage of it, and turbofans for airplanes and steamships, or not steamships, but propeller-driven ships in the ocean, those may start seeing alternative sources of energy, or a prioritization away from the kind of consumer stuff more towards the industrial stuff.
Yeah. Well, James Howard Kunstler, who we've mentioned before, has a couple books out, series actually, the World Made by Hand series, and those are a kind of a interesting guide to one guy who generally knows what he's talking about. It's the idea of what will happen in post energy future. A guy that both Adam and I think have listened to in the past. I think because I got into this whole dissident right thing via the kind of the prepper constitutionalist movement, in like 2007, 2008 type time frame, and earlier than that actually. And Jack Spirko, who runs the Survival podcast, not the biggest fan of some of his ideas about race and such, but preps are preps, and preps generally should make your life better. I think that's a vitally important point. If you get off of dependence upon your car and you start walking or riding your bicycle, you're going to be in better shape. It's going to make your life generally better. If you stop taking your car everywhere for trips of like 3 blocks and just walk, you'll be in better shape, and it will make your life better. If you ride your bike places for, like if it's 5 miles away and you ride your bike and it takes an extra 15 minutes, you will be in better shape. If you live in a place where you can walk everywhere, you will get to know your neighbors, and life will be better because you'll know your neighbors and won't be stuck in your car all the time. If you are not dependent upon the grid by having small-scale hydro and some wind power and some solar power, and you sell money back to the grid, maybe the power goes out. Maybe there's some sort of terrible EMP. Maybe terrorists attack transformers and destroy stuff, and the grid goes down. And you don't need it. But, you're generating your own power, even if none of that happens, and you're getting a little bit of money stuck in your pocket for selling power back to the grid. If you're growing your own food, if you've ever done it, the stuff you grow yourself is so much better than anything you can buy at the store. It's not even funny. If you've ever hunted your own food, you know that the stuff you've killed yourself is just so much better and so much more satisfying than the stuff that you buy at the store. If you've ever tried grass-fed beef versus, grain-finished beef, you know that that's so much better. And I don't know, Adam, how much you want to get into the whole colonies thing, but I guess we can put a link in the show notes to the show that we did, or that I did previously. But your life is better if you live differently, right? Because life in modern America sucks, right? You pay a huge amount of taxes to support a bunch of people that hate you. You have 1.2 kids. You send them off to the gladiatorial academy that is the public school. You and your wife both work. You spend an enormous amount of time in the car. I mean, there's all kinds of things about it that are terrible. And so getting out of that system is all to the good.
As long as you're willing to work. That's the one requirement, because it's not easy if you don't want to work. But otherwise, it's very exciting. And I'm actually engaged in a lot of this myself. I prepared actually a lot of notes, which I think is probably going to be too much detail for this call. But what I would like to propose is I would like to keep a running conversation going about these topics, not every week, obviously, but over time. If you're interested, Dark and Nick, if you think it's not too boring, and hopefully if anybody's listening wants to leave a comment, if they think this is a good or bad idea, please let me know. But what I'd like to do is, this Brian Hayes book is pretty well structured, and let's just take like the top 3 or 4 categories, and then kind of go through some of the history about how they came to be. For example, like how do we have an interstate highway system, or how does our telecommunications system work today? And then how do you actually do those things yourself? And what I mean by I'm doing it is basically, I'm engaged in, doing power generation, doing construction, doing, fixing things myself, machining, all that crap. People may not like it, but if you actually start learning it, and then you learn that you can do it, and you're actually pretty good at it, or at least competent at it, it's actually like you've entered into a different dimension where you suddenly realize that you don't need all this stuff that you worry about. And it's a huge liberating moment in my life that I've experienced, that I would love to have anybody who cares about the stuff we care about also experience.
Yeah, I don't think all listeners all know this, but this is actually a sustainable organic internet history podcast.
Right. We're not certified, but yeah, you can judge for yourself based on the merits of our quality of effort and product. That
it's not kosher certified,
right? Or FDA.
Well, this is one of my favorite shows, and I want to. We were talking about this before the call, but Myth of the 20th Century, I think, is a very apt title, because if you think of the 20th century as starting in 1898 with the Spanish-American War, which was ginned up and fake, and ending on September 11th, 2001, which was also ginned up and fake. The entire structure of society, all the major events, both world wars, war in Korea, the war in Vietnam, the Gulf War. I mean, you guys have covered all of this stuff extensively. Like the civil rights movement. Like there are myths sold to us by hostile forces that are often communist in orientation, and the whole better living through chemistry, processed foods, go for a Sunday drive in your '57, Ford Fairlane that guzzles gas like desperate alcoholics do beer. All of that's also, this myth, this lie, and this whole system of infrastructure that we built up over the course of this long and deceitful century is breaking down, and it can't be fixed, because in order to fix it, we would have to do things like get rid of finance capital and be honest with ourselves about the composition of our nation in terms of population. And we'd have to have people study things like engineering and welding and all of that anymore, and have our men not go to general humanities courses, but have people actually know stuff, and they'd have to work really hard to understand these things. And our women would have to do things like stay home and have babies, and not work in these useless HR jobs, and all of those things. While I'm supportive of all of those things, they're not going to happen on a mass scale. And so, if you're listening to the show, you're a dissident, you need to understand that you're going to have to do a lot of this stuff for yourself. So,
well, I think of the 20th century largely as the century of forgetting. It was sort of it's where things are being lost that were previously understood, where we come from, where culture comes from, where life comes from. And this does fit in that ways. We've begun to forget where these things that we've taken for granted, of the machinery, of the things that keep the material life going. We don't even really know where those come from anymore. We certainly don't know the forces that were able to create them in the first place. But now we're getting to the point where it seems like the knowledge of even maintaining them is being lost.
On the first part of the journey, I was looking at all the life. There were plants and birds and rocks and things. There was sand and hills and rain. The first thing I met was a fly with a buzz and the sky with no clouds. The heat was hot and the ground was dry, but the air was full of sound. I've been through the desert on a horse with no name. It felt good to be out of the rain. In the desert, you can't remember your name, 'cause there ain't no one for to give you no pain. La 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 After 2 days in the desert sun, my skin began to turn red. After 3 days in the desert fun, I was looking at a riverbed, and the story it told of a river that flowed made me sad to think it was dead. You see, I've been through the desert on a horse with no name. It felt good to be out of the rain. In the desert, you can't remember your name, 'cause there ain't no one for to give you no pain. La 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 la. After 9 days, I let the horse run free, 'cause the desert had turned to sea. There were plants and birds and rocks and things. There was sand and hills and rings. The ocean is a desert with its life underground and a perfect disguise above. Under the cities lies a heart made of brown, but the humans will give no love. You see, I've been through the desert on a horse with no name. It felt good to be out of the rain. In the desert, you can't remember your name, 'cause there ain't no one for to give you no pain.